Uh, I think having heard Professor Vidyasagar so far, it's our pleasure and privilege to have Professor Arun from IISc, who's going to give a talk on improving machine vision using insights from biological vision. I think most of you saw the abstract of what is looking to be an interesting talk. Just to briefly introduce the speaker before we hand over the stage to him, Dr. Arun received his BTech from IIT Bombay and MS in PhD from Johns Hopkins University, all in electrical engineering. He then completed his postdoctoral research at CMU and since joined the Center for Neuroscience at IISc, where he is currently an associate professor. His group works on how the brain transforms sensations into perception, and considering the significant focus around deep learning and perhaps a one-dimensional view at that, I think it would be very interesting to listen to Professor Arun's views to see deep learning from a different viewpoint, from a neuroscience viewpoint. So thank you again for accepting this invite. I know it was very, very short notice. Thank you for doing this, and I'll hand over the stage to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vineet. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to all of you. So I think most of you would know more than me about deep networks. So if I say something wrong, feel free to pipe in and say that I'm wrong. So I'm actually a faculty in the Center for Neuroscience. So I'm sort of interested in fundamentally understanding how the brain does vision. Two major challenges for AI, as I sort of from whatever I've understood, and this is actually best put by this book by Douglas Hofstadter called Metamagical Themas. And so what he basically says is that the two major challenges, and maybe this is a bit of tongue-in-cheek statement. The first problem is, what is the letter A? And this is a problem of perception, mostly what I'll be talking to you about. And of course, as you can imagine, the second challenge, if you go by the same theme, is what is the letter I? And this is, of course, the problem of intelligence. Now, it turns out, I think I heard Professor Vidyasagar also mention things of this kind, which is that even the very, very simple problem of recognizing distorted letters has proved to be actually far more difficult than we initially sort of foresaw. And by and large, the fact that we still see some of these distorted letter tests on websites is proof that this problem is still not completely solved. So the question is, how is it that our vision is able to do it so well? And that's really the question that sort of motivates a lot of my research in the lab, that we're trying to understand what are the ways in which the brain does vision or perception so well and so much better than how computers are doing. And you may be wondering, well, why is a neuroscientist even talking about deep neural networks? And actually, to answer this question, I have several different types of answers. One is, of course, that there's a long history of mutual inspiration between neuroscience and AI. Very often, neuroscientists use metaphors that the AI community sort of develops. Sometimes the AI community starts using, ideas inspired. It's really it goes both ways.
Professor S.T. Arun.
The other thing I want to also start highlighting to you as we go along is that vision is not a simple problem for the brain either. So it turns out that vision actually occupies nearly 40% of the brain area. We don't really understand very much about visual processing in the brain. And so there's a large part of the brain as a result that we don't really understand too well. And that's simply because we don't really understand what is happening in the brain when it's doing visual processing. Okay. Recently, of course, visual representations in the brain have been found to match nicely with deep networks, and this has raised some bunch of interesting scientific questions. People are using deep networks to try and understand feature representations in the brain, and then, of course, the idea is that maybe something that we find as differences between the brain and deep networks can perhaps be put back into a deep network and make it even better at doing vision. Of course, I do want to caution that saying that one is a model for the other does not really advance our understanding unless we really come up with some interesting computations or some kind of interesting computations or theoretical account of what's actually really happening. And we don't want to really substitute one unknown with another unknown. So that's another thing that we are very careful about. We want to understand the brain, but also, and perhaps using deep networks, but we also want to understand deep networks in the first place, because perhaps both are performing similar kinds of computations on the incoming image. Yeah. Eventually, of course, that's what I was just alluding to, that brains and deep networks are both solving the profound problem of vision, about which we understand very little. And if you look at the history of computer vision as well, there's a long history of sort of using handcrafted image features, or using very specialized kinds of detectors, but then we don't really understand sort of the deeper problem of what is happening when the 3D images, when a 2D image is being formed out of a 3D world, and what are the kinds of things that are, what are the features that remain invariant and so on. There's relatively little theory of in terms of what we understand there. Yeah. Of course, you might also say, well, what's the use? And this is, of course, a kind of difficult question to answer. I mean, we of course want to understand brains, we want to understand deep networks, and eventually, of course, if you understand something deeply, you should be able to lead to make improvements to it, and really make deeper improvements in performance than just simply incremental changes. So the hope is that by understanding the brain, or by understanding deep networks, how they perform computations on the image, we should be able to come with insights that help us in understanding the brain. Of course, also should help us in improving how these state-of-the-art algorithms are doing vision. So that's sort of the overall goal here. I just want to give you a sense of what we do in our lab. It's not just looking at deep networks or brains. So the grand goal is sort of how the brain solves vision. We do this using a number of different experimental techniques. So the first one is by just simply looking at visual perception in humans. So we bring human subjects or volunteers into the lab. They perform various kinds of visual tasks, and we want to understand, using their performance, what is the nature of the underlying representation that they're using. If you go a little deeper from the level of behavior, that is just simply input to output. If you go a little deeper, then of course you get to things like you can do brain imaging and perturbation kind of studies in humans, which we can do at a very coarse level. So we take people into an MRI scanner, we image the activity of the brain, use the activity in different parts of the visual pathway to make inferences about what's going on. I won't be talking about much of that, but this is still among the many different kinds of things we do. A third and also important line of work in our lab is to look at the neural machinery in the brain. And so we perform very fine scale recordings of from single neurons from the brain of animals, in this case monkeys, because their visual system is very similar to ours. And then by doing these finer scale neural recordings, we are hoping that we can extract sort of interesting dynamics, crosstalk between different brain regions and so on, information that we would not get otherwise from human studies. Yeah, and a uniting theme to all of this research is to really to build computational models and build good descriptions of what's going on in the brain. And if the description is really sort of in the form of a computation, then we can hopefully take it back into a real computer vision algorithm and perhaps even improve performance. So that's the overall goal. So let's start by looking at, well, what is the similarity between when computer vision algorithms perform some sort of vision task versus when humans do a vision task. And so it turns out that if you take a very simple task of, say, object detection, it's actually quite similar in machines and humans. So if you consider this image, for example, in a machine vision algorithm, you would actually take this image, you pass it through and extract a bunch of image features, and then the image features are actually taken forward into a classifier. This is some kind of classifier that you use, whatever your favorite classifier is. And then you come up with a final classification saying that this image contains a person, a man. Yeah, you might have, it turns out that even in the brain, something roughly similar happens. And so when you have this image, for example, you have an extraction of visual features in the back of your brain. So that's the back of the head. Incidentally, if you get knocked in the back of your head, you will see stars because that's literally your visual cortex getting stimulated. Okay, so this is all feature extraction, and we know that the visual cortex in the human brain, as well as in the brain of monkeys and other animals, we know that their visual cortex is extracting pretty complex features from the image. Yeah. Now, you have a stage afterwards in the brain, which is actually some kind of decision-making stage. So if you ask a person to perform this kind of task, you give them an image and you tell them what does it, you ask them what it contains, and they'll give you some kind of binary label saying that this particular image contains God. Yeah. So the idea being that the extraction of image features and of course also the decision-making stage is actually quite similar. There are parallels that you can draw between the way the human brain does it versus what a computer vision system might do. Yeah. So then a natural sort of question is, well, can we compare performance, right? So, and people have been doing comparisons of performance. We are not the first to do it. But here's the issue, right? So if you take a simple sort of vision task, say recognizing letters, or say, for example, declaring what's in an image, well, most of these tasks are very, very easy for humans. So humans will typically be at 90% correct, or even much more. I mean, 99% correct, I would say. And the few mistakes that human beings would do is under some speeded conditions where it respond really fast or something like that. Now, in the case of computers, again, if you take a standard image, image recognition or object recognition task, I mean, the performance of computer vision algorithms is also pretty good. I mean, you get 90%, 85%, 90%, depending on the data set, of course. And so then when you have two such sort of systems which are performing at such a high level, then there's no point in looking at the differences because both of them are getting almost everything correct. So then the question that we were starting to wonder is that, well, we know that deep networks have all these vulnerabilities like adversarial examples and, bad classifications on seemingly nonsensical things. So then can we come up with tasks or images on which computers also find it hard and maybe humans might find it easy, or conversely, can we find out and tease out differences? So that's what I'll sort of describe in this first study, which is that can we compare machines and humans on a hard task? Okay, so the idea is that if you take a hard task, which is a hard task for humans as well as machines, you might observe interesting differences in performance. And so we tried a bunch of tasks in the lab, and eventually what we settled on is actually a face recognition task. Okay, so this is actually a task that we sort of I don't think there's any use in us learning this task, but we all know this task. So this is the task of actually detecting if someone is coming from different regions of India. I think all of us have had this experience where you look at a person and then you say, oh, this person looks like he's from Kerala or like Tamil Nadu or Andhra, or we are able to make these judgments like pretty effortlessly, right? So the question is this, so a couple of interesting questions, right? First of all, this is just anecdata in the sense that I know that I can do this task for certain kinds of faces, but what is the human performance on this kind of task? And we had in fact colleagues who even told us that I don't think people could do this task very reliably. It may be in very extreme examples that you can make it out, but maybe not in this way. So we set out to actually characterize human performance on this task. Okay, so here is a snapshot of sort of human performance. What I'm showing you here is actually a bunch of different faces, and for each face, we actually took a photograph of a real person and we asked them which region they're from. And we wanted to make sure that they're not actually, North Indian, one of the parents is North Indian and the other parent South Indian and so on. So we actually ensured and we asked them that, are you both parents North Indian and so on and so forth. And so we validated this label. And then we asked a bunch of independent human subjects, not the people that are taken photographs here, but just an independent set of people. What do they think is the category of the face? And this is actually a snapshot of the performance. What we have done is to order the faces from hardest to easiest. And one thing you can notice at the rightmost column is that there's a bunch of faces where people are very, very reliable. Everybody is very consistent. They're all reliably classified as North Indian or South Indian. And the other set of faces, there's a bunch of faces here which are actually misclassified, which means that the person actually is from North or South of India and they're being misclassified consistently by a large number of people. This is actually almost over 100 subjects in this experiment. And so a lot of people are thinking that these people are actually from some other part of India than they're actually from. So, but the point is that there's actually a very wide range in performance. And if you look at the average performance of people, it's about 65% correct. Okay, so this sets up a nice sort of situation for us because the task is actually doable by human subjects, but it's not easy. Okay, there's a bunch of faces for which even humans have a hard time classifying. Okay, so that's the basic setup. Now the question, of course, the interesting question, of course, is how easily can you train a computer vision system to actually do the same task, right? So here's just the snapshot of how we do it. We selected a bunch of face-trained deep networks, and so you all know the architecture of the basic deep network, and so this is what is happening across many different layers. And at the final layer, you have a classification layer, which is classifying the face into a bunch of different known categories. But what we do is to take the penultimate layer, which is supposed to be just the feature representation that's giving rise to good face recognition. So we just take the pre-trained face network and then analyze the activity of the final penultimate layer, which is representing the faces in a good way, in a manner suitable for recognition or classification, whatever. Yeah. But now there's a problem because we don't understand when you take the deep network, the network is actually pulling information from the entire face. And we wanted to get some insight into the problem in the sense that we wanted to know which region or which part of the face you're using for this classification. In fact, I would even ask all of you to introspect at this point, which features do you think you're using, right? And it's interesting that we don't really have any verbal access to these features. I mean, like you just know that you can do the task. I think all of you would agree that you know that you can do the task. But then you don't know what features you're using. So clearly your language part of your brain cannot describe what features you're using, right? Something that your visual system is just doing almost automatically. So we thought, okay, let's get some insight into the problem. So how do we do it, right? So then we said, okay, let's take the face. We'll register it using these traditional computer vision algorithms. So we registered every face into these standard sort of set of landmarks. And then we started extracting features from different parts of the face. So we said, okay, let's take all the intensities of the region of different parts of the face, like only the eyes, the intensity of the nose, the intensity of the skin. We could also take spatial features like the distance between the eyes, the size of the eyes, the size of the mouth, and so on. So, and then of course, you can also take an exhaustive set of features where you just take all pairwise distances between every pair of features in this automatically registered face. So then now the stage is set. We have a large database, and actually it's not large by computer vision standard, but it's large enough because we have to collect data from a large number of people. And so we have almost about 1,500 faces in our database, which are classified with either being the South Indian or North Indian, according to our definition. And then we can then say, can we train classifiers using whatever features we extract from the face to classify the face as being from Northern or Southern India. So here are the sort of the summary of results. It's a complex table, so let me take you through it. So there's a total number of faces, 1,500. The human performance is 64%, and there's some standard error, but basically it's a hard task for humans. Now the set of things that I'm showing here are actually the classification performance. All of this is cross-validated performance, of course. And so this is the classification performance of different types of feature sets. So when you say CNN over here, these are actually the features derived from deep neural networks. And it turns out that actually features extracted using the histogram of gradients actually does sort of the best on this in this sort of task in a cross-validated sense. Because remember, different sets of features have different amounts of degrees of freedom. So the cross-validation takes care of all that. And so this is the performance we get. So you can see that the best algorithms, for example, this one is based on the spatial and intensity features from the face, and you can see that the best algorithm is performing at almost the same level as humans. Okay, so now the question is, well, if you take now we have two systems, both are performing at about 65% correct. Now let's look at the correlation in the errors of these two algorithms. And so this is the correlation that we got. So what we did was we took the average accuracy of humans on each particular face. So there's a bunch of 1,500 faces. So we have the average accuracy of humans on those things. And then we correlated that with the accuracy of the algorithm, each of these algorithms or each of these classifiers, right? And this is what we get. So this is the correlation with human accuracy. And just to give you a sense, humans are very, very consistent in the sense that if you take two independent groups of people, and you look at the correlation in their accuracies on these faces, you actually get a pretty nice correlation, right? So this is shown in the last bar on the right-hand side, okay? But you can see now the rest of these are actually all of these different face recognition. I mean, these are all the different feature sets and the classifiers based on these different models. And you can see that all these models actually have a pretty low correlation with what humans are doing. And so just to be sure that these classifiers are, I mean, in one case we've trained humans, I mean, humans, of course, we don't know what they're trained on. But in the other case, we've trained these classifiers on a specific set of labels. So we thought, okay, maybe these labels are not very good, or maybe the data set is not good. So let us try to use these feature sets to directly predict the accuracy of humans. And if you try to train these models to predict human accuracy, even then they don't do too well. So the point being that somehow the face recognition features that are being used by both deep networks as well as these handcrafted like sets of features, all of these actually are not showing a good correlation with human perception, which means that somehow we are using a different sort of set of features or different sort of method of classification. We don't really know, right? So that's one thing here. The other thing we also noticed is that there was a systematic difference in the classification performance depending on different regions of the face. So this is what is shown, the same table over here, just highlighted certain part of the table. And what I'm showing here is the features extracted from the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the contour of the face. Okay. And so what we're doing here is to take the features from different parts of the face and train classifiers based on those particular parts of the face. So these classifiers specifically have information only from the eyes or only from the nose or only from the mouth. And what we found here in this analysis is that the mouth, all the features that are derived from the mouth are actually the ones that are most important for classification, in the sense that the classifier based on the mouth features actually gave us the highest performance. So then we said, okay, that's an interesting result, but then is it possible that humans are also doing the same kind of thing where they prioritize the mouth and somehow that is leading to good classification? So then we tested that in an experiment, and the experiment basically is the following. We take a face and then we can occlude the eye region or the nose region or the mouth region, okay? And by occluding different parts of the face, we wanted to make sure that we wanted to look at whether the classification accuracy. We asked people to classify these faces after occluding the eyes, nose, or mouth, and we asked them to do the same task. And so here's the performance of subjects on the same task. What you can see here is that blocking the mouth actually made the accuracy drop a lot, whereas blocking the eyes, for example, didn't make the accuracy drop too much. So what this means is that people are losing a lot of relevant information when the mouth is blocked, suggesting that we are also using the mouth region for doing this classification. Yeah. Please feel free to ask me any questions. I'm not in a hurry to listen to myself all the time. So if you have any questions about this up to this point, please feel free to stop here and ask me. Okay, so just to wrap up whatever we've shown here, if you compare machines and humans on hard tasks, what we think is that this is an interesting kind of analysis because it reveals systematic differences in error patterns, right? So then, of course, we've started by saying, okay, we have humans and machines doing similar things on when they look at an image. And if you directly compare performance, you shouldn't just be comparing performance on like an easy task. If you compare it on a hard task, you will see systematic differences. So that's an area where if you potentially, you can actually say, can we train computers to actually match human performance? And maybe then they learn better features or become more robust or less vulnerable to adversarial attacks and all kinds of things. But the point is that we've observed certain systematic differences, right? So then the next question, of course, is can we go beyond comparing performance? This is all work done by Pramod, who was a PhD student in the lab. Now he's off at MIT, he's studying more interesting things like physics of intuitive physics and so on. So now what Pramod and I thought was, well, we can compare performance, of course, but then can we go to a level where you shortcut this classification process and get to something more interesting, which is the features? Because we are ultimately interested in the features that are extracted by the brain in performing. And if you think about the overall problem, you could actually make the feature extraction simple and the classification problem more complex, or you can actually make the feature extraction complex and the classification simple, which is, I think, what is actually happening. That the feature extraction is really complex, but the classification is actually quite simple. I'll tell you offline if somebody asks. I can tell you why I think that's the case, but I think that's really what's happening. So really the interesting comparison is the feature. Okay, so but how do you compare features, right? I mean, for a computer vision algorithm, of course, you get a feature vector in response to an image, but then where is the feature vector for a human brain, right? So that's sort of the question that you might initially think, well, how do you even do this comparison? Because a deep network has thousands and thousands of units. The human brain, of course, has billions of units. And we can't hope to even sample the packing density of the brain and can't really sample all the neurons. But still, if you collect a population of neurons and responsive neurons, how do you even compare these two sets? Right? Because there's no kind of correspondence between like unit 13 in a deep network to unit 461 in the brain. So there's no way to achieve a correspondence. But there's also a deeper problem. Even if the brain and deep networks are representing the same sort of features, it could be that the brain has a rotated feature set and the deep networks have some other feature set. And so the two feature sets may actually be rotations of each other. So if you directly compare the activation along each of the axes, you may not actually get anything very useful because the feature sets are not really related directly. So what you really want to do is to have a representation where you can compare the distances, because the distances between objects in some space will be invariant to rotations of this feature set. So at least short of affine transformations, we are good. So then actually what you really need to compare if you want to compare the features is not comparing the features directly, but rather comparing the distances. And so then the question is, okay, great, you're saying that you can compare distances. So then how do you compare distances? So, and in the case of a computer vision algorithm, of course, again, you have a feature vector to the image of a cow, then you have another feature vector to the image of the rotated cow, and you simply calculate the distance between these two feature vectors like a Euclidean distance. But then how do you calculate perceptual distance? Well, that's where we come in, because we've been doing some work in the lab where we've been able to establish that a particular kind of behavioral response is directly a measurement of perceptual distance. So let me give you an example of that. It's a very natural task that all of us can do. Luckily, you don't have to tell people to say, okay, imagine the perceptual distance between, the cow and the rotated cow and all that. You don't need to ask such things. You can just make them do a very natural task. So the natural task here is basically the following. I'm going to show you an image and I'm going to ask you to, I think, raise your hands if there's a feature like this. I think there's a feature like this in Zoom. So basically raise your hand if you see a leopard in the image. Yeah. I'm going to wait a little bit so that some people at least find the leopard or whatever. Yeah, so I see a couple of hands. Someone has raised the thumb, which is fine. And so basically, I'll show you where the leopard is. And this is dramatic, right? So a couple of things to note here. First of all, the leopard didn't get adapted or didn't optimize its spots over the course of one lifetime. It's of course over the course of many, many lifetimes. But it's trying to evade detection by deer. That's its natural sort of prey. And so even though the optimization is there for the deer, all of us actually have the same sort of response, which is that the leopard is very hard to detect. So which means that everybody has the same visual system, whether you're a mammal or you're a vertebrate or invertebrate. Roughly speaking, the same challenges are there. The second thing you notice is that there is actually hard to find, is because the markings of the leopard make it difficult to detect in the surroundings. In other words, the leopard has become similar to its surroundings over the course of evolution, of course. So then this gives us a very natural sort of idea of how to actually get distances in perception. Because if you put a target, which is an odd one out, surrounded by distractors, the ease with which you find the target is related to how dissimilar the target is from surroundings. So in this case, the target is similar, so you take a long time to find it. So simply if you measure the time taken to find an image in its surroundings, that becomes a measure of perception. And we've actually managed to show that this actually behaves like a mathematical distance metric. All of visual search. So then we can say this is the way in which we measure perceptual distances in visual search. Yeah. And so here, for example, is a bunch of images, and we are actually taking these images and measuring perceptual distances by using search. And if you think about it, the longer you take, the more similar is the target. So the reciprocal of time is actually a distance measure. And so we measured a bunch of perceptual distances. And then, of course, for computer vision, we can directly take the Euclidean distance. And now the question is, how is this distances, which are the perceptual distances in humans, collected on a large number of different objects, related to the computer vision distance between, or the Euclidean distance between feature vectors of different computer vision. Okay, you want a big distance, and we are trying to predict the perceptual distance using a combination of different computer vision models. And it turns out that if you want to predict the distance, you get a pretty nice correlation. So for example, here the correlation points are 4. So that's well and good. But what we were more interested in seeing is whether there are systematic deviations. So what we've done here is to mark out the central portion where the correlation is pretty good. And we wanted to look at these portions where the perceptual distance is less than what's predicted. And here the perceptual distance is more than what's predicted. And so if you look at systematically all of these deviations, we found that there are actually a number of different systematic deviations. So first of all, these are the overestimated pairs where the predicted distance is more than what is observed. And you can see here that many objects, when they're identical short of viewpoint or they share some parts, they typically actually show this overestimation because the predicted distance is more than what is observed. But the other category was also interesting, which is that the predicted distance from computer vision models is actually less than the observed distances in perception. So this is, and one particular category was actually very interesting to us, which is the symmetric objects. Okay. So what we noticed is, so in other words, just to put the result in words, if you take symmetric objects, the perceptual distance between symmetric objects is more than what is predicted by computer vision models. And here we've done this for a number of different models, including handcrafted features to like CNN features and GoogleNet and ResNet and so on. And all models show the same bias, which is that the symmetric objects tend to be more distinct in perception compared to what is predicted in the computer vision models. So then the question is, well, okay, so symmetry somehow is not captured by deep networks or even any other computer vision model. So then can we take symmetry in some way and actually improve the performance of the deep network? And this is what we did in a subsequent study. What is shown here is a pipeline of how we do it. So we take an image and we pass it through a pre-trained deep network and we get, of course, class probabilities. We also built a parallel sort of feature extraction, which is based on detecting symmetry along any possible axis. So we actually defined 16 possible directions and we calculated simply the match between the two halves of the image. And so if you take the match between two halves, that's a measure of symmetry. And so then we can train a classifier based on the symmetry score of a particular image and see whether this symmetry classifier is actually benefiting the classifier returned by the regular pre-trained deep network. And to cut a sort of longer story short, basically what we find is that there is a clear improvement across different categories. Some categories show no change, but a lot of categories which are heavily symmetric or heavily asymmetric actually do show a very strong improvement on when you take the regular deep network and augment it using symmetry features. Yeah. So what this at least tells me is that we can now actually have this case where we've compared deep networks with human perception. We found some systematic bias, and now incorporating this particular bias back into the deep network leads to tangible and clear improvements in performance. Although they may not be a lot, but still it's a significant improvement compared to, because these deep networks are already saturated on these data sets, right? They're already heavily trained on this, heavily optimized. So even getting a small improvement is still some progress. Yeah, so that's what we are showing here in the next study, which is that if you compare representations in machines and humans, you can observe systematic biases like symmetry. And if you incorporate these biases, you can actually even improve performance. Right? So that's the second study. I don't know if you have time to go into maybe one more study. Maybe.
Yeah, sure, sir. Until 3:35. Until 3:35, you could.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks. So then, so far we've been talking about systematic biases in terms of quantitative differences, because you can see that symmetric objects are represented a little bit differently from humans, but maybe even computer vision algorithms have the same sort of representation of symmetry, perhaps, right? So what we decided to do in our next study is to say, well, can we ask something about qualitative differences between deep networks and humans or biological vision, right? So basically what we said is, do deep networks sort of see the way we do? Well, what do we mean by seeing the way we do? Well, it turns out that vision scientists, people have been looking at human vision, have devised a number of interesting perceptual phenomena which allow us to query deep networks in the same way. So let me give you an example and it will become clear what I mean. So the example that I want to give here is actually known as the Thatcher effect. So if you look at these two faces, right? These two faces look pretty grotesque, grotesquely different. This is the face of Margaret Thatcher, but what the authors have done in this particular study is to actually invert the individual parts of the face. So the eyes are inverted and mouth is inverted. What is really dramatic about the Thatcher effect is that if you invert these two phases, right, then you don't see a very big difference between the inverted versions, right? And you can literally check it for yourself. If you're holding a convenient device, you can rotate it, and you'll find that the bottom row is looking really different, and the top row, which becomes inverted, is, so it's a very dramatic effect. But if you look at this effect, what it's really telling you is actually that it's a statement about the representations of these images. What we are really saying with this Thatcher effect is that the two upright faces are far more distinct in our perception compared to inverted faces. And this is indeed what has been observed in humans. And there's a study that goes back to the 1980s. So this is a well-known effect. Everybody knows this. And it's a fun visual phenomenon that we show in our open day and so on. But the interesting point here is that the Thatcher effect refers to the fact that the perceptual distance between upright faces is more than the perceptual distance between inverted faces, right? And armed with this particular statement, we can now go into a deep network and say, can I take every layer of a deep network and then ask whether the distance between the upright faces is becoming different from the distance between the inverted faces? So this is exactly a question that I can ask. And suppose I find in a deep network that the inverted distance is larger, then it means that the representation that you have in that particular deep network, or even for that matter, any algorithm, that representation is actually different from what is there in humans. Right? So that's the idea. So let's go in now and look at what the effect is. So remember, the perceptual representation is expected to be something like this. So to quantify this perceptual representation, I can calculate a Thatcher index, which is actually just a minus b by a plus b, where a is the upright distance, the b is the inverted distance. So you do like this kind of index. So if this index is positive, it means that it's human-like. Right? So now we can take the distance between feature vectors in a deep network. You can now map this across layers, which is nice because you have a deep network organized in some kind of hierarchy. And now we can say anything above 0, what you get will be something similar to humans. And this is what we get from the VGG16 architecture trained on object classification. So it's only trained on ImageNet. It's not been trained to recognize faces or anything. And you can already see here that there is an initial kind of Thatcher effect. But then in the final fully connected layers, you actually don't see a Thatcher. It means that the deep networks that are trained on object classification do not show a Thatcher. But if you do the same kind of comparison on a face-trained deep network, so it's the same architecture, but it's been trained on face recognition, and now you can see a very robust kind of Thatcher effect emerging. Right? And so what this means is that the Thatcher effect is not there sort of because of, it only arises because of face recognition. Right? So this is the basic layout. So we can say, I'm going to take a well-known effect in human perception. I'm going to convert that into a statement about the distance between, a statement about perceptual distances. And now I can calculate that particular effect across layers of the deep network and just see what's happening. Right? So here's another effect where it doesn't work in the same way as humans. So there's something called the global advantage. And this is again a very well-known effect characterized in the 1970s. The effect is basically that when you look at a shape like this, people are actually much faster to report the global shape than the local shape. Okay, that means that people react much faster to say that this contains a circle than to say that this contains a square. And so this has given rise to this whole notion that humans see the forest, we see the forest before we see the trees, and so on. You must have heard statements like that. But if you think about this particular statement, right, what it really means is that we are really sensitive to the global arrangement of items and not really sensitive to the local features of those items. So we can convert this into a statement about the distances between objects and distances between different kinds of shapes. And here is the key comparison, right? So I take this circle made of squares, and if I make a square made of squares, then the distance between these global and this is a global change because the local elements are the same, but the global shape has changed. But if you compare this change, this is a local change because the overall arrangement is remaining a circle, but I've changed the local elements from square to circle. So the point here is that the global change is actually much more larger in our perception than the local change, which is why the global change is more noticeable than the local change, right? So and we've measured this now in a separate study, so we know that this is actually true in perception. So now we can again go back and look in what's happening in deep networks. So remember, the perceptual effect is this. We can calculate this into we can we can calculate a single number that represents the effect by simply looking at the comparison between the global change and the local change. And here we found something very interesting to us. You have the same global advantage effect, which is plotted across layers. And what you see is that if you take human perception to be anything more than 0, the VGG network, which is trained on object classification, actually shows a local advantage, which means that the VGG, the standard sort of pre-trained VGG network actually has a local advantage, unlike humans, which have a global advantage. Now we know that this is actually congruent with a number of other studies. For example, people have done these things where they transfer the texture of one object to the shape of another object and so on, and they found that deep networks actually classify objects using the texture rather than the overall shape, whereas people do the opposite. So we actually classify using the shape and rather than the texture. And we've done now a comparison of a number of different properties between deep networks and biological vision. And here's a summary of what we find. We find actually very similar results in all kinds of different feed-forward neural networks. All of them are trained on object classification, by the way. And you can see that there's a bunch of places where we get an answer no, which means that the deep networks do not show the effect the same direction as humans do. And so what this means is there's a bunch of missing properties. One of them, of course, I just showed you, which is the global advantage. And the others are also stuff that you can read about. We don't have to, I can't describe it in the interest of time. And so basically what we find is that if you compare machine and human perception, you can actually find qualitative differences. So these are places where deep networks do exactly the opposite of what humans are showing, or their brains are showing. So then our hope is that by describing these properties, we can actually incorporate them back into deep networks and perhaps improve their performance. So I think that's all I have time for. And I'll wrap up by showing you a summary of our studies. I was planning to tell you a little bit about how our brain recognizes distorted letters. Maybe that's a story for another day. And I'll wrap up by saying, thanking all the funding agencies that are supporting this work. And of course, these are all the people who are in the lab at the moment. And I just want to give a small shout out to people who are interested in exploring this interface between computer vision and visual neuroscience. If you're interested, please do contact me. We're looking for people who are able to work at the intersection of these two things. Yeah, and thanks. I guess I'll take questions.
Thank you, Arun sir. There are 3 questions in the chat. You may read all of them and then pick the one you like to answer.
Yeah, so I'm, oh yeah, so chat, yes, okay. Okay, so what's the sample number of humans considered in the human experimental classifying phases? This is actually, in that particular experiment, is almost 200 human subjects. Typically in much of our later experiments where we're doing visual search, it's actually far fewer. We usually take about 20 subjects, but in that particular experiment, it was a few hundred human subjects. Then does formulating fMRI activity of the brain help us in better feature representations of brain? So yes, so we are using fMRI to look at representations of the image, and we find that, for example, if you look at perceptual distances in behavior, like using visual search, and if you look at neural representations in different parts of the brain, there are particular parts of the brain that seem to correlate really well with perception. There are some higher visual areas, so we are able to do such things. We haven't used fMRI activity for image reconstructions. Others have done so. We have actually not done that. We've been planning to do something like that, but there's already a bunch of work in that regard. So we would have to figure out how we can do it better. Then there are new networks built to handle more symmetries, example rotation. Do your observations hold in such cases also? We actually don't, we haven't looked at networks that are built to handle symmetries. So, but I think what I would say is that all of our data is actually open source. We put it up on publicly, and so if you're interested in comparing networks trained to handle symmetries versus networks that are not trained to handle symmetries, I'd be very interested to know what you find. So yeah, maybe we can talk if you're interested in doing something like this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arun sir. This is a very unique perspective to understand where deep learning started from, the neurons and the biological works that happen.
Yeah.
One augments the other, and that's the best thing we could learn out of this session. And thank you for your time.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Arun again. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great.